John had always been a man of routine, quiet, reserved, and meticulous. He preferred the hum of his computer over the chatter of social gatherings. When he decided to move to a suburban neighborhood, it wasn't for the charm or the community. It was because he needed a fresh start. The house on Maple Street seemed perfect, spacious enough for his work-from-home setup, with a backyard that promised room for future gardening projects. But what John didn't know was that this quiet little street came with its own set of rules and its own self-appointed enforcer. From the moment John stepped out of the moving truck, Karen noticed him. She was the kind of woman who thrived on control, someone who took pride in keeping things just so. As president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, she made sure everyone followed the guidelines she deemed essential for maintaining order. Her manicured nails flipped through HOA rulebooks like they were sacred texts, and her sharp eyes missed nothing. So when John's unkempt lawn became visible just 2 days after his arrival, Karen sprang into action. It started with a letter slipped under his door. "Dear resident," it began, followed by a detailed list of infractions, including the length of his grass and the placement of his maillocks. John read it, raised an eyebrow, and tossed it aside. He figured it was harmless, a minor annoyance from someone trying too hard to keep up appearances. Besides, he had more pressing matters to attend to, like unpacking boxes and setting up his home office. But Karen wasn't one to let things slide. Over the next few weeks, John noticed subtle changes around his property. One morning, he found his garden gnome turned upside down. Another day, there were faint tire marks on his driveway where no car had been parked. At first, he chalked it up to coincidence, or maybe even kids playing pranks. But then came the whispers. During his first HOA meeting, a mandatory event for all new residents, he heard snippets of conversations about himself. Words like unfriendly and disruptive floated through the air, though no one dared say them directly to his face. Karen sat at the head of the table during that meeting, her lips curled into a smug smile as she presided over discussions about neighborhood standards. She didn't single John out verbally, but her glances in his direction spoke volumes. It was clear she had already formed an opinion of him, and it wasn't favorable. By the end of the meeting, John felt uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Something about Karen's demeanor unsettled him, as if she saw him not as a neighbor, but as a problem waiting to happen. As days turned into weeks, John began to feel like he was living under a microscope. He caught glimpses of movement outside his windows late at night and heard faint buzzing sounds that didn't belong to insects. At first, he dismissed these occurrences as products of his imagination. After all, why would anyone care so much about what he did behind closed doors? But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. And unbeknownst to him, Karen was only getting started. One evening, as John sat in his home office typing away at his computer, he glanced out the window and froze. Hovering near his backyard was a small black object with spinning blades, a drone. It hovered silently, its camera lens pointed directly at his house. At first, John thought it might belong to a neighbor who enjoyed flying drones as a hobby, or perhaps it was part of a delivery service testing new technology. But something about the way it lingered unnerved him. Over the next few days, the drone kept reappearing. Sometimes it would circle his property slowly. Other times it would hover close to his windows, almost as if it were inspecting the inside of his home. Each sighting left John feeling more uneasy. He began to wonder, was this really just a coincidence, or was someone deliberately targeting him? Determined to get answers, John decided to take action. He installed security cameras around his yard, positioning them strategically to capture any unusual activity. For several nights, he reviewed the footage, fast-forwarding through hours of empty skies until he finally spotted what he was looking for. There it was, the drone, unmistakably hovering near his house, its camera trained on his windows. What disturbed him most was how deliberate its movements seemed. It wasn't random exploration, it was surveillance. The pieces started falling into place when John struck up a conversation with one of his neighbors, an older man named Mr. Peterson, while walking his dog. Mr. Peterson mentioned that Karen had recently purchased a high-end drone, boasting about how it could keep an eye on things around the neighborhood. The comment made John's stomach churn. He realized that Karen wasn't just nitpicking about his lawn. She was actively spying on him. As the truth sank in, John felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone invade his privacy like this? And why? Was it because of the letter she'd sent him about his lawn? Or was it something deeper, some personal vendetta she'd developed simply because he didn't bow to her authority? Despite his frustration, John knew he couldn't confront Karen outright. She thrived on drama and conflict, and accusing her without solid proof would only give her ammunition to turn the situation against him. Instead, he resolved to gather evidence and expose her behavior. He spent hours researching drones online, learning everything he could about their capabilities and weaknesses. He even joined online forums where hobbyists discussed anti-drone techniques, though he kept his intentions vague. Each time the drone returned, John documented it meticulously, noting the time, location, and duration of its visits. He also started paying closer attention to Karen herself. He noticed how she often stood by her front window, watching his house with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Once, he caught her talking animatedly on the phone while gesturing toward his backyard. It was becoming increasingly clear that Karen saw him not just as a nuisance, but as a project, an adversary she needed to control. John's mind raced with questions. Why was she so obsessed with him? Did she think he posed some kind of threat to her precious neighborhood standards? Or was it something else entirely? Whatever the reason, John knew one thing for certain. Karen had crossed a line, and now it was time for him to figure out how to push back without losing his cool, or giving her the satisfaction of seeing him crack under pressure. John wasn't the kind of person to let things slide, especially when it came to his privacy. The more he thought about Karen's drone spying on him, the angrier he became. But anger wouldn't solve anything, not unless he channeled it into action. And that's exactly what he did. Being a software engineer, John had always been fascinated by technology. He spent hours researching ways to counteract drones and stumbled upon something called a signal jammer. It was a device designed to disrupt wireless communications, effectively cutting off the connection between the drone and its controller. At first, he hesitated. Was it legal? Would using such a device get him into trouble? But after reading up on local laws and confirming that personal property protection fell within reasonable limits, he decided to take the risk. After all, Karen had already crossed ethical boundaries. Why should he play by her rules? The next step was setting up a system to monitor the drone's movements. John rigged his security cameras with motion detection software, ensuring they would alert him whenever the drone appeared. He also purchased a few decoy gadgets, a cheap toy drone, and some blinking LED lights to confuse Karen if she tried to retaliate. His plan wasn't just about stopping the drone. It was about making sure Karen knew she couldn't mess with him without consequences. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood continued as usual, or so it seemed. Karen remained as smug as ever, strutting around like she owned the place. During HOA meetings, she dropped veiled comments about certain residents who didn't respect community standards. Everyone knew she was talking about John, but no one dared say anything directly. Some neighbors avoided eye contact with him, clearly intimidated by Karen's influence. Others gave him sympathetic smiles, silently acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. What frustrated John most was how Karen acted like she was untouchable. She carried herself with an air of superiority, as if her position in the HOA gave her the right to meddle in people's lives. Her latest complaint: a note slipped under his door claiming his car was parked too close to the curb. John rolled his eyes and tossed it in the trash. If this was the best she could do, she was wasting her time. But deep down, John knew Karen wasn't done. She thrived on control, and losing it, even slightly, would drive her crazy. Every time he saw her peering out her window or whispering to other neighbors, he felt a pang of irritation. Still, He refused to let her win. Instead, he focused on perfecting his strategy. He tested the signal jammer in his garage, making sure it worked properly before putting it to use. He mapped out potential scenarios, thinking through every possible outcome. If the drone crashed, where would it land? Could he minimize collateral damage? These were the details that mattered. As he prepared for the inevitable showdown, John found himself feeling strangely energized. For years, he'd lived quietly, avoiding conflict and keeping to himself. But now, faced with someone as overbearing as Karen, he realized he had a chance to stand up for himself, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of everyone else who had suffered under her watchful eye. The thought gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. Little did Karen know, her days of unchecked power were numbered. John was ready, and when the moment came, he intended to make it unforgettable. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the neighborhood seemed almost peaceful. Children played in the streets, and the distant hum of lawnmowers filled the air. But for John, the calm was deceptive. He had been waiting for this moment, biding his time until Karen's drone made another appearance. And sure enough, just as he settled into his living room with a cup of coffee, the familiar buzzing sound reached his ears. John moved quickly, grabbing the signal jammer from its hiding spot in his desk drawer. He glanced out the window to confirm what he already knew. The drone was hovering near his backyard again, its camera lens pointed directly at his house. His jaw tightened. This was it. No more games. With a deep breath, John activated the jammer. For a few tense seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the drone wobbled mid-air, its smooth flight interrupted by the loss of connection. It spun awkwardly, struggling to regain stability, before plummeting toward the ground like a stone. John watched with satisfaction as it crashed into Karen's pristine swimming pool, sending a splash of water cascading over the edges. The commotion didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors who had been lounging on their porches or tending to their gardens rushed over to see what had caused the racket. Within moments, Karen stormed out of her house, her face red with fury. She marched straight to the edge of the pool, where the soggy remains of her prized drone floated pathetically on the surface. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, glaring at anyone within earshot. Her voice carried across the entire block, drawing even more attention. "This is vandalism. Someone did this on purpose." John stood quietly by his window, watching the scene unfold with a small, satisfied smile. He didn't need to say a word. The evidence spoke for itself. The drone had clearly malfunctioned, or so it would seem to everyone else. No one could trace it back to him. Still, he couldn't resist stepping outside to join the growing crowd of curious neighbors. As Karen continued her tirade, pointing fingers and accusing invisible culprits, John noticed something interesting. Not everyone was taking her side. Some neighbors exchanged skeptical glances, while others whispered among themselves. One woman muttered loud enough for John to hear, "Honestly, that thing was always flying around. Maybe it got what it deserved." Karen, oblivious to the murmurs, turned her wrath toward John. "You," she snapped, jabbing a finger in his direction. "I know you had something to do with this." John raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Me? Why would I sabotage your drone? I don't even know how to operate one." His calm demeanor only infuriated her further. "Don't play dumb with me. You've been against me since the day you moved here." Before John could respond, Mr. Peterson stepped forward, trying to mediate. Now, Karen," he said gently. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Accidents happen, after all." Karen huffed but reluctantly backed down. For now. As the crowd dispersed, she shot John one last venomous glare before retreating into her house, dragging the ruined drone behind her. John returned to his own home, feeling a mix of triumph and amusement. He hadn't expected things to escalate so publicly, but he wasn't complaining. If anything, Karen's overreaction had only made her look worse. Later that evening, as John sat on his couch replaying the day's events in his mind, he realized something important. This was just the beginning. Crashing the drone into her pool might have been satisfying, but Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. She would come back harder, angrier, and more determined than ever. And John needed to be ready. If Karen had been difficult before, she became downright relentless after the drone incident. Her public accusations at the pool hadn't stuck. There was no proof, and her outburst only made her look unhinged. But that didn't stop her from escalating her campaign against John. She began filing complaint after complaint with the HOA, each one more absurd than the last. First, it was a noise violation. According to Karen, John's late-night work sessions were disturbing the peace. Never mind that he kept his windows closed and used headphones. Apparently, the faint hum of his computer fan was enough to disrupt the entire neighborhood. Then came parking infractions. She claimed his car wasn't aligned perfectly with the curb, even though John measured it himself and found it well within regulations. The list went on. Improper trash bin placement, excessive use of holiday lights, and even a bizarre accusation that his mailbox leaned too far to the left. Each time, John received a formal letter from the HOA demanding compliance. At first, he responded politely, providing evidence to refute her claims. But as the complaints piled up, he grew tired of playing along. He knew what Karen was doing, wearing him down, hoping he'd crack under the pressure. What she didn't realize was that every baseless accusation only fueled his determination to fight back. While Karen focused on paperwork, John turned his attention to strategy. He upgraded his signal jammer, ensuring it could handle any future attempts at surveillance. He also purchased a couple of decoy drones, cheap models he programmed to mimic erratic flight patterns, and stationed them near his property. If Karen sent another drone his way, he wanted her to think twice about whether it was worth the risk. Between the jammer and the decoys, John felt confident he could keep her at bay. But Karen wasn't content to stay behind the scenes. During the next HOA meeting, she launched into a dramatic speech about uncooperative residents who refused to follow the rules. Though she never mentioned John by name, everyone in the room knew exactly who she meant. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others rolled their eyes. A few shot John sympathetic glances, silently acknowledging how ridiculous Karen sounded. What surprised John most was the growing divide among the neighbors. Some still clung to Karen's side, either out of fear or loyalty, but others were starting to question her motives. One evening, as John watered his plants, Mrs. Thompson from across the street approached him with a tentative smile. "I just want you to know," she said softly, "not all of us agree with Karen. She's a lot." John nodded, appreciating the gesture. It was small moments like these that reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. And then there was Mr. Peterson, who had subtly started challenging Karen during meetings. "Perhaps we should focus on bigger issues," he suggested during one particularly heated discussion. "Like fixing the potholes on Elm Street." Karen bristled at the comment but couldn't argue without looking petty. Slowly but surely, cracks were forming in her carefully constructed facade. Despite the mounting tension, John refused to let Karen dictate his life. Instead, he channeled his energy into strengthening his position. He reached out to other neighbors privately, asking if they'd ever noticed anything unusual, like drones hovering near their homes. To his surprise, several admitted they had, though none had dared confront Karen about it. Armed with this new information, John realized he might have leverage after all. Late one night, as he reviewed footage from his security cameras, an idea began to form. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he'd show her exactly what that looked like. But this time, he wouldn't act alone. For the first time since moving to Maple Street, John felt like he might actually have allies. And together, they could bring Karen's reign of control crashing down. The breaking point came during the annual neighborhood barbecue, an event that was supposed to bring everyone together, but instead turned into a battleground. Karen had been unusually quiet leading up to the gathering, which made John suspicious. She wasn't one to let things slide, and her silence felt like the calm before a storm. When she finally approached him near the grill, her Her tone was sharp and accusatory. "John," she began, loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear, "I've tried to be patient with you. I've given you chance after chance to comply with basic community standards. But clearly, you have no respect for this neighborhood or its rules." John set down his plate of food and met her gaze calmly. He'd expected this confrontation and wasn't about to back down. "Karen," he replied evenly, "the only person who seems to have a problem with me is you, and most of your complaints are baseless. You can't just make up rules whenever it suits you." Karen's face flushed red, and her voice rose even louder. "Baseless? What about my drone? Huh? Don't act like you don't know what happened to it." Now all eyes were on them. Neighbors paused mid-conversation, pretending not to eavesdrop while secretly hanging on every word. John crossed his arms, standing his ground. "Your drone crashed because it malfunctioned. That's not my fault. Maybe next time, you should think twice before invading someone's privacy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Privacy. The word caught people's attention. One neighbor leaned over to another and whispered, "Wait, was she spying on him?" Before Karen could respond, Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, clutching her lemonade glass. "Actually, Karen," she said hesitantly, "I did notice your drone flying around my backyard last month. It made me uncomfortable. I didn't say anything at the time, but, well, maybe John has a point." Karen's mouth dropped open in disbelief. "That's completely different," she sputtered. "I was monitoring the neighborhood for safety reasons." "Safety?" Mr. Peterson chimed in, raising an eyebrow. "Or control? Seems to me you've been using that drone to snoop on all of us." The whispers grew louder as more neighbors nodded in agreement. Even those who had previously sided with Karen now looked uncertain. For the first time, they saw her behavior for what it truly was, invasive and unnecessary. Humiliated but unwilling to admit defeat, Karen doubled down. "Fine," she snapped. "If none of you care about enforcing the rules, then I'll take matters into my own hands. Mark my words, John. I'm filing a restraining order against you. Let's see how smug you are when a judge gets involved." Her threat hung in the air, but instead of intimidating John, it gave him clarity. He realized Karen's biggest weakness was her reliance on fear and authority. Without evidence or support, her threats were empty. That night, as he reviewed security footage and pieced together everything he knew about Karen's antics, inspiration struck. He had access to technology, proof of her misconduct, and growing support from his neighbors. It was time to expose her once and for all. Using his technical skills, John hacked into Karen's drone system, not to cause harm, but to retrieve stored footage. He discovered hours of recordings showing her spying not just on him, but on several other homes. Late-night flyovers, close-ups of windows, even shots of private backyard gatherings. It was all there. With the footage in hand, John prepared for the final showdown. At the next HOA meeting, he planned to project the truth onto the big screen, leaving no room for denial. As he worked late into the night, John couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just about stopping Karen anymore. It was about reclaiming their neighborhood from her toxic grip. Tomorrow, the entire community would see her for who she really was, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next HOA meeting was unlike any other. The room buzzed with anticipation as neighbors filed in, whispering among themselves about what might happen. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual air of authority tinged with nervous energy. She glanced around the room, clearly uneasy but trying to mask it with her trademark smugness. John arrived a few minutes late, carrying a small projector and a laptop. He set them up quietly, ignoring the curious stares. When the meeting began, Karen immediately launched into a tirade, accusing John of harassment and demanding stricter enforcement of HOA rules. Her voice carried its usual sharpness, but this time it lacked conviction. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged knowing glances. When she finally paused for breath, John stood up. "Before we move on," he said calmly, I'd like to share something important. It's relevant to recent events and to Karen's claims. Karen's eyes narrowed. What is this nonsense? She snapped, but her tone betrayed a flicker of unease. John connected his laptop to the projector and dimmed the lights. On the screen appeared footage from Karen's own drone. Sweeping shots of backyards, close-ups of windows, even recordings of private family moments. Gasps rippled through the room as neighbors recognized their own homes. Faces turned red with embarrassment and anger. Karen's jaw dropped, but she quickly recovered, stammering, This is out of context." "Oh, really?" John asked, raising an eyebrow. "Then why does the timestamp show these videos were taken late at night? Or why do they include audio of conversations you had no business overhearing?" The room erupted into murmurs. Even those who had previously supported Karen now looked horrified. Mrs. Thompson leaned over to her husband and whispered, "Is that our backyard? She recorded us barbecuing last summer." Mr. Peterson stood up, his expression stern. "Karen, this goes beyond enforcing rules. This is a violation of trust and privacy. How could you think this was acceptable?" For the first time, Karen seemed truly rattled. "I was protecting the neighborhood," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "You can't expect me to sit back while people break the rules." "But spying isn't the answer," another neighbor chimed in. "And frankly, your obsession with control has gone too far." As the discussion unfolded, the tide turned decisively against Karen. One by one, neighbors spoke up, not just about John, but about how Karen's behavior had affected them all. Someone mentioned the nosy inspections of their garden. Another recounted how she'd complained about their child's basketball hoop being left in the driveway overnight. Each story chipped away at Karen's credibility until there was nothing left. By the end of the meeting, the HOA board voted unanimously to strip Karen of her leadership role and issue a formal apology to John. Humiliated, Karen stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. No one followed her or tried to stop her. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal, or rather, a new kind of normal. Without Karen breathing down everyone's necks, the community grew closer. Neighbors started talking more, hosting impromptu gatherings, and even organizing a block party. John became something of a local hero, not because he outsmarted Karen, but because he'd stood up for himself and inspired others to do the same. As for Karen, she retreated into obscurity, rarely seen outside her house except to maintain her pristine pool. Occasionally, someone would joke about turning it into a fish pond, given how many drones had ended up in it. But for the most part, she faded into the background, a cautionary tale about power and hubris. John often found himself smiling as he worked in his backyard, the hum of his computer blending with the sounds of laughter from nearby homes. He hadn't moved to Maple Street looking for drama, but in standing his ground, he'd gained something unexpected, a sense of belonging. And every time he glanced at Karen's pool, shimmering under the sun, he couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, had landed right where it belonged.